Canada pass on Boeing's combat-proven jet, and they chose an AWACS from a country that owns half the Arctic. On May 27th, Prime Minister Mark Carney walked onto stage at CANSEC, Canada's biggest defense trade show, and announced that Canada had picked Saab's GlobalEye as its new airborne early warning and control aircraft. 6 of them, a program worth more than 5 billion Canadian dollars. The Royal Canadian Air Force's first dedicated AEW&C fleet ever. To get there, GlobalEye beat 2 American jets, Boeing's E-7 Wedgetail, which is the gold standard, the plane the US Air Force, the Australians, and the Brits all picked, and L3 Harris's Ares X. Now, before anyone sends Saab a fruit basket, nothing is signed. Carney announced Saab as the preferred supplier and opened formal negotiations. In procurement terms, that's an engagement ring, not a marriage. But it's a clear signal, and the signal is the story. So here's the question I actually want to answer. Did Canada buy the better airplane, or did it buy the better answer to a problem Boeing couldn't solve no matter how good the radar is? Those aren't the same question. Let me show you why. Hey friends, Wes O'Donnell here, veteran of the U.S. Army Infantry and the U.S. Air Force, where I worked on the radar system of the E-3 Sentry AWACS. And I want to start with what these planes do, because radar plane undersells it by a country mile. An AEW&C aircraft is 2 jobs bolted together. Job 1 is to see. It's a radar mounted high enough to look down and spot low, small, fast things that ground radar misses. Cruise missiles skimming the deck, drones, fighters hugging the terrain. Job 2 is to quarterback. The people in the back don't just watch the picture, they run the fight. They tell friendly aircraft where to go, who to engage, and who to leave alone. In the military, we'd call it command and control. Think of it as the offensive coordinator with a headset and a God's eye view. The 2 planes split the difference on both jobs, and that split is everything. So for the Wedgetail, Boeing took a 737, the most common airliner on Earth, and bolted Northrop Grumman's Mesa radar to the top. It's a flat blade instead of a spinning rotodome. The headline feature is that it sees a true continuous 360-degree view without turning the airplane. Imagine a security camera that watches the whole parking lot at once, versus one you have to keep panning by hand back and forth. And because it's a big airframe, you can cram 10 to 12 operator stations in the back. That's a lot of headsets. That's a lot of people running the fight at once. The Aussies liked it so much, they sent it to help Ukraine and NATO in late 2025, and they sent one to the Middle East this year to track low-flying Iranian drones and cruise missiles, which is the exact thing it's best at. It also refuels in the air, so it can stay up for 17+ hours. So far, the Wedgetail sounds like the obvious pick. Well, hold that thought, because we're going to talk about Saab's golden boy, the GlobalEye. Saab took a Bombardier Global 6500, which is a long-range business jet, the kind of thing a hedge fund guy flies to Aspen, and turned it into a multi-sensor surveillance platform. The main radar is Saab's Iri ER. It's an ASA radar built on gallium nitride, which is a newer chip material than the gallium arsenide in the Mesa. In plain terms, GAN lets you push more power through a smaller package, and Saab claims it bought them a roughly 70% jump in detection range over the older Iri. Saab says the instrumented range comfortably clears 650 kilometers. Some open source estimates push it towards 775 kilometers. I'll come back to those numbers because they deserve a side eye, but here's the part nobody mentions in the glossy brochure. The Iri doesn't see 360 degrees. It's a long blade looking out about 150 degrees on each side, with blind spots out the nose and the tail. To fill the gaps, Saab stacks on more sensors, a separate Leonardo maritime radar for ships and surface contacts, electro-optical and infrared cameras, signals intelligence gear. So GlobalEye isn't one giant radar truck, it's a Swiss Army knife. Air, land, sea, and electronic snooping all fused into one picture. But what about the cost of going small? Well, fewer headsets in the back, that's somewhere in the 5 to 10 range depending on whose numbers you trust, against the Wedgetail's 10 to 12, and no air-to-air refueling. GlobalEye stays up 11 to 13 hours and then it has to come home. So, line them up honestly, and the Wedgetail is the better pure air battle quarterback. More operators, true 360, in-air refueling, combat record. The GlobalEye, though, is the better all-around scout. More kinds of sensors, lower running cost, and it'll land on a short, icy Arctic runway that the 737 would look at and say, "Nah, bro, I'm good." Canada knew all of this, and it picked the scout anyway. Let me tell you why that doesn't shock me from the cheap seats of someone who's actually flown on the E3 Sentry. When you're working on an AWACS, the radar is maybe a third of the job. The thing you live and die by is whether you can operate. Is it fully mission capable? Can your gear talk to your fighters? Can you get the parts? Can you get the airplane fixed when something breaks at 3 in the morning in a country that isn't yours? The most beautiful radar in the world is a paperweight if the supply chain that keeps it flying answers to somebody who might not pick up the phone. And in case you haven't noticed, Canada, the US has recently stopped picking up the phone when Canada calls. And that's the whole ballgame here. Why would Canada buy a radar jet from a country who verbally abuses it? Did the US think Canada had no other options? So here's what we don't know. We don't actually have a clean spec sheet shootout between these two radars. And anyone who tells you otherwise is reading marketing copy. The good numbers are classified. Saab says 650 plus kilometers. Northrop says the Mesa's range is comparable. Comparable to what? Measured how? Against what kind of target? And how much electronic jamming? Nobody's publishing that, and they probably shouldn't. We also don't know how GlobalEye holds up as a battle manager in a big, messy coalition fight, because it hasn't been in one. The UAE flies it, and the Emiratis aren't exactly hosting press tours. When Britain looked hard at the business jet AEW&C platform, it walked away partly because it didn't think it could fit enough operators in the back to run the kind of air war the RAF plans for. That's a real concern, not Boeing spin. And one more time, Canada hasn't signed anything. This is a preferred supplier and a handshake. Defense deals have died at exactly this stage before. So if you came for Sweden's radars objectively better, I can't give you that. The truth is murkier and more interesting, because Canada didn't run a radar competition, it ran a sovereignty competition. And the radar was almost a tiebreaker. Look at the table Carney was sitting at. NATO had picked the Wedgetail back in 2023, then scrapped the order in 2026 after the US backed out and started leaning towards space-based early warning. Instead, the economies of scale that made the E-7 cheap evaporated. Then you add in the tariff fights and the open American threats toward Canada over the past year. The same pressure that is Ottawa reconsidering its F-35 buy, by the way. Carney said back in March that Canada was going to take full responsibility for defending its own Arctic after decades of just riding along with the NORAD arrangement. A Boeing jet means American maintenance, American logistics, American software, American mission data. Every one of those is a wire running back to a capital that just spent a year reminding Canada the wire can be pulled. The GlobalEye cuts those wires. The mission system is Swedish. The airframe is a bombardier built in Toronto, which means Canadian jobs and a Canadian industrial base instead of a check mailed south. Buying it is the difference between owning your tools and renting them from Home Depot, where the guy behind the counter has lately been hinting he might not rent to you anymore. For a country whose actual problem is watching a brutal, empty stretch of Arctic and the sea approaches around it, a cheaper jet that lands on short northern strips, carries a maritime radar, and answers to nobody but Ottawa isn't a compromise, it's the assignment. Does Canada give something up? Yes, genuinely. It's trading away some top-end battle management muscle and the ability to loiter forever with in-flight refueling. If Canada's job were to run a massive coalition air campaign over somebody else's airspace, I'd tell you it bought the wrong plane. But that's not Canada's job. Canada's job is to see its own north and own the seeing of it. For that mission, the trade is smart. Politically, it's close to unanswerable. You can disagree on the margins of the radar, but you can't argue with a country deciding it wants the keys to its own defense. So, did Canada make the wise choice? On the spec sheet, it's a coin flip, wrapped in classified ink. On the map and in the politics, it's not even close. Canada looked at the best branded jet in the category, did the recon on who controls it, and decided a slightly smaller radar it fully owns beats a slightly bigger radar somebody else can switch off. 5 years ago, that would have been heresy in Ottawa. This week, it got a standing ovation at a trade show. That tells you the math didn't change. The trust did. And here's the part that sticks with me, and it's bigger than one airplane. For most of my life, Buy American wasn't a defense decision. It was the default setting. The water you swam in. You bought the jet, the radar, the missile, and the alliance came stapled to the receipt. Well, Canada just quietly peeled that staple off, in public, in front of every defense executive in the country. That's not a story about Sweden out-engineering Boeing. That's a story about what happens when allies stop assuming the phone gets answered and start building so they don't have to call. The West is learning to stand on its own feet again. Some of us think that's overdue. I worked on the old version of this jet, believing the cavalry was always coming. Canada bought a jet built on the assumption that it might not. I hope they're wrong, but I suspect they're right. That's it for today, my friends. If you got something out of this, do 3 things for me. Hit subscribe because I run the recon on this stuff so you don't have to read 40 procurement filings. Drop a comment with whether you'd have picked the Wedgetail or the GlobalEye, and tell me why. Because you guys in the comments are smarter than half the military news sites out there. I pride myself on having a smart audience. And if you want the long written analysis, that's over on Substack or just wesodonald.com. Oscar Mike, I'll see you in the next one. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.